week podcast of Bright Lights, our weekly excursion into the world of achievers and achievements. Tonight's guest, one of the top achievers, is a former NBA player, Royce White, current professional player. He's still playing in the 3-on-3 league. We're going to get into that shortly. As you know, that is rarefied air to be an NBA player. A lot of people want to be that. A lot of people dreams. Only a few make it. So we're going to talk to Royce about his experiences there. As you know, recently always had in the news mental health issues among athletes. Naomi Osaka, uh, Serena Williams in the world of tennis. I think recently the Minnesota Vikings, Griffin had some issues here locally we're familiar with. A.J. Brown with the Tennessee Titans in the world of football. And so we're going to explore that and see what it's like and what type of policies they have in place and what's the experience like in dealing with it, especially in today's media market where you got social media and everything is everybody's life is out in front of everyone. So we're going to talk to Royce about his experience there and just all his sacrifices and his attitude, his perspective, how he overcame obstacles to achieve his goals. So we're going to get into all of that and leave some positive messages for our young people. Well, I couldn't think of too many things. Normally, I start off my podcast with in the news this week, and I guess the thing that came to my mind is right now they want uh, vaccination cards to eat in Minneapolis and St. Paul restaurants. And, I can't keep track of all this stuff, man, that they want. And so I'll be probably eating mostly outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul when I go out to eat until they eliminate that particular policy. I just, I just read and I'll just leave it that way. I read for myself and understand things for myself. Um, I may make an exception because I feel sorry for the restaurants downtown and the businesses down there, what they've done and all the policies that basically bankrupt a lot of them, put them out of business. But so that's the big item I think in the news that affect me here personally, because me and my wife we like to go out and grab a nice dinner every once in a while. But once again, until they get rid of that policy, I'll be eating in St. Louis Park and other places besides Minneapolis and St. Paul. So that's that for that. We talked about Mr. White here. Oh, by the way, while you're at it, go out and click on the bell for notifications. Uh, Click like, uh, click the subscribe button. We have an online store, so go out there and see is there anything of interest there for you, and support the program. So that's it as far as introduction tonight. I want to get directly to our guest tonight and have him share some of his life experiences and accomplishments with your achievements with you tonight. So without further ado, we're going to bring on Mr. Royce White. Uh, Welcome to Bright Lights, Royce.
Thanks for having me, Lacy. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, I appreciate having you here. Well, as I told the audience before we brought you on, you've basically been an achiever here in the world of athletics and basketball and other things here, all the while I've known you. Give us a little background before we get into your basketball career and your NBA career. Give us a little background as far as your childhood and growing up. I know you spent some time playing basketball over here in the hood and things. So just
Yeah.
give us a little background on your childhood growing up, Royce, your family and everything.
Well, again, thanks for having me, Lacy. I would say that I am a product of the Twin Cities through and through, in that I was born and raised in St. Paul. I grew up in a single parent household, although my father was in my life in a capacity, but he didn't live with us. Um, so, my mother was a single mother and she worked as an esthetician, working class woman who made ends meet with tips, right? Cash tips. And we live downtown St. Paul, but my family is originally from the Rondo neighborhood. Both my families, my grandfather on my mom's side and my grandmother on my mom's side. I have very deep West Side roots. My Mexican family helped found Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is the Mexican Catholic Church there on the West Side. And I played basketball on the North Side. For the better part of my childhood. My mother worked in Edina. My grandfather, Frank White, was the director of Park and Board for Richfield. My grandmother worked for the Attorney General. She also worked in South Minneapolis. So I'm a product. I'm a product of a bunch of Twin Cities neighborhoods. I'll say that, and because of that, I have a very very deep love and loyalty to Minnesota, but the Twin Cities as well. I grew up playing basketball on the North Side, like I said, for the Minneapolis Hustlers, which is one of the few grassroots teams that produced a fair number of pros that came out of Minnesota, whether it was directly in my era or the eras that came after. A lot of young guys played for the Minneapolis Hustlers there over north. And yeah, I'd say right around 7th or 8th grade, I started to go to school in the East Side community in St. Paul. I went to Cleveland Junior High because I lived downtown St. Paul, so the nearest school to me was Cleveland Junior High on the East Side on Arcade there, and got looped in with this Johnson High School basketball program. And finally, when I made it to the 9th grade, I decided to go to LaSalle. And that was the start of my All-American high school basketball career, you could say.
So, how old were you before you realized, hey, I can be pretty good at this?
It came on a little later, right? It was like
Mm.
7th, 8th grade, I'd say. I played in a tournament one weekend, and I was able to do a lot of the things that I wanted to do on the court in terms of scoring, passing, rebounding, blocking shots, getting steals, and that was probably the first time I really had an idea that I could take basketball at least far enough to get a scholarship.
Okay, and did you ever think of being anything else when you grew up? Do you remember the age when you said, "Hey, I want to be this when I grow up. I want to do this for a living"? And was it basketball or was it something else?
You know, I grew up in the Chicago Bulls era, right? I'm a '90s baby, so I
Hmm.
guess my conception of professional basketball was such a high standard, right? Michael Jordan was and still is the pinnacle of basketball, right, in terms of skill and ability. So I guess for a long time growing up, I loved the game. I started playing when I was 5 years old. I actually started playing in South St. Paul because my grandmother lived in West St. Paul, but I eventually ended up over north around 3rd grade. But I started in kindergarten in South St. Paul, so I never really thought of being good enough to play professional. Obviously, I wanted to. I idolized a lot of the professional players. I watched the NBA a lot. WGN was the local champ back then during cable. You had
Hmm.
WGN, and so we got all the Bulls home games. So I watched a lot of professional basketball, but I just never thought about in terms of being a professional basketball player. I did have an understanding of our financial situation and me potentially being able to use basketball to get a scholarship to college. But when I was young, I used to say I wanted to be an architect. And then I got old enough to realize that I really wasn't that good at drawing. So now you can be an architect and not draw.
Right, right,
But
right. You got
the in
computers and
between
stuff
there,
for you.
that
Yeah.
wasn't there wasn't all these apps that drew stuff for you. So that was one of my early childhood dreams. You could say was to be an architect. But I really liked archaeology. I was into archaeology early. I was into ancient civilizations and history early. But
Hmm.
it never dawned on me to be anything professional relating to those fields. I just had a strong like for those topics in school. When I was at home, I read books about history and ancient civilization and things of that nature.
Yeah, some of the things that I read about you indicates that you've always been a pretty good scholar and interested in school and learning and things like that. What how do what do who do you attribute it both? First of all, your athletic skills to. Which parent do you attribute that to? Which parent do you attribute your
Don't hey
interest in academic?
don't try and get me in trouble with Mom Dukes and then.
Yes, that's true. Okay, let's skip that.
We have very strong athletic genes on both sides. My father, he was originally from Omaha, born in Omaha, but he grew up in Detroit. And he and my mother met when they were in their early 20s. And he graduated from a D2 school, and got his degree, but he played basketball there. He was on scholarship. So he's 6'7", built like
Okay,
me, was a
okay,
little bit more athletic, probably they say, and shot the ball well. So there was that side of the family, and the genes that came from my father. But on my mom's side, although my mom didn't really play sports, she's 5'11", so she had
okay.
a very she gifted me genetically, for
Right.
sure. But she didn't play sports too much. But my mother's family, for example, my grandfather Frank White again, and my uncle Junior White, were both high level high school athletes, and they played multiple sports. And then my grandfather Lewis White, who is we call Lewis White Jr. We call him Junior, but his father was Lewis White as well. He still holds the I think he still holds the batting average for St. Paul high schools in baseball, and
Oh
he
wow.
batted like 720 his senior year. So he was an incredible baseball player, and he probably could have played in the Negro leagues, but he had my grandfather early when he was young. And at that time, when the Barnstormers came through and they wanted to bring a player on to go travel, if you had a family, you stayed home and worked because they weren't paying much for you to do that at the
Right,
time.
right, right, right.
But he was a baseball player that was locally somebody they would come and get when they had barnstorming games here locally in the Twin Cities. And many of the players that did play in the Negro Leagues and that did participate in those barnstorming games back in his day speak very highly of his skill. So, he was an incredible athlete. And then, my grandfather's very close friend, who was like an uncle to me, is Dave Winfield. So I grew up in a sports family, to say the
Right.
least.
Okay, well, we're gonna get past the basketball here in a little bit, but I do want to tie up a couple of things. I do know you won, I think, two state championships, high school basketball championships here. One
Hmm.
with De La Salle, which I think at the time was a 3A school, and then one with Hopkins. I think at the time was a 4A school,
Yep.
and then I think, if I recall correctly, you ended up initially attending the University of Minnesota. You was a Gopher initially,
Yep.
because I remember there was always this big cry where we didn't get a lot of the great Minnesota players. They went elsewhere, and you were one of the
Uh,
people that stayed here, and I remember that. And then eventually, I think you transitioned to Iowa State. Explain to our audience why starting off at Minnesota and then eventually transitioning to Iowa State, where I recall that's where you really made your rep at, and all the fame as a college player came
Yeah,
from.
well, by the time I was a senior in high school, well, first of all, when the first rankings came out, rankings were a new thing for high school basketball, relatively new when I got to high school, in the sense that the internet was becoming more popular. So people were checking the online scouting services more frequently. So
Right.
those became more popular. And when the first set of rankings came out for what used to be rivals.com, I'm not sure if it is now. I think it may be ESPN.com or 24/7 Sports. I'm not sure which one. But anyway, rivals.com was the big scouting service at the time. And when their first rankings came out for my class, I was one of the top 25 players. I was ranked 17th, and I was the second small forward in my class. So throughout high school, I was already in that All-American tier when it came to national recognition, which I was fortunate to have. I mean, before my era, let's say Minnesota basketball wasn't respected the same way. We
Hmm.
weren't on the national scene, partly because a lot of the national writers were located on the coasts.
Right,
right? And
right,
they just didn't get to see Minnesota basketball at the grassroots level. Now, after my class came through and we sort of broke that shell and the internet became more accessible, you see players like Tyus Jones and Rashad Vaughn and some of the, Gary Trent Jr. and, Jalen and all these other younger players now that were at the top of the rankings right away, right? And
right, right,
it
right,
was unheard of that a Minnesota player be ranked number one, mostly
right.
because they didn't even see us. So by the time I had gotten to Hopkins my senior year, I mean, I had offers from almost everybody in the country. I had a lot of. Can you still hear me, Lacy?
Yes, I can. We
Yeah, I
got
had a lot of offers, all over the country. So um, my approach to the selection process was always Minnesota first. And I'm a Minnesota loyalist, and I admit that, especially when it comes to sports. You could not, I could not like you personally, but if you're competing as an athlete from Minnesota or for a Minnesota sports team, I'm by default cheering for you.
right.
And I mean, I just grew up in a Minnesota sports family, so that's just kind of how I came up. So I wanted to go to the University of Minnesota. I understood the history of the university's basketball team and the fact that we hadn't gotten a lot of high-level recruits. The few that we had, Chris Humphreys did come from Hopkins, and he had played at the U of M for one season. And I came about 5-6 years after him. They didn't have as much success as they wanted to have with his team. And I just wanted to do something that was going to bring the community together. And I know that basketball had always been that for me growing up. But also when I had been at the University of Minnesota for basketball games, I spent a lot of time watching Gopher games coming up. So it was an easy decision, even though University of North Carolina was offering me, and Texas, and USC, and all of these huge major colleges in these real special places in our country. I was loyal to Minnesota.
Okay. And then I think it's safe to say, and you can correct me, you helped put Iowa State Cyclones on the college basketball map also. Tell us about your experience at Iowa State, because that's when I think you really gained national attention and moved up the draft board. So
Yeah.
what was that experience like at
So,
Iowa
so I,
State?
tra- I transferred to Iowa State my freshman summer, and it was interesting how that all came about. When I decided to transfer for the University of Minnesota, which I hated that I had to do, they actually wanted me to come back and play the year after I had to sit, which all had to do with that entire legal situation, and
Right.
we'll maybe talk about that a different time. But um, I was done playing basketball. I wasn't even going to play anymore. And a mutual friend from the Nike circuit knew me and was connected to John Calipari. And John Calipari was interested in having me come to Kentucky, and I actually committed to go to Kentucky. And there was Baylor was also in the mix when I decided to transfer because Jared Nunez was down at Baylor and he was a Hopkins guy. And then UCLA was also in the mix as well because I just loved UCLA's history, the
Right.
history of the program. And
Uh-huh.
also, UCLA has a beautiful campus for anybody who hasn't been there. At the time, Iowa State wasn't even in the mix. And then I got a call from another mutual friend who knew me and also knew Fred Hoiberg, who was going to be the incoming coach at Iowa State. Obviously, that was his alma mater, and it
Hmm.
was going to be his first year. And we had a lot of long conversations just about life, about my story, what his plan was for the team. And he had played with Kevin Garnett. So Kevin Garnett was one of those players who really transformed what a power forward did in the game. And there were times even when Flip Saunders would use Kevin Garnett bringing the ball up as a point guard when Sam Cassell got hurt in one of their better years, one of the better runs that the Wolves had. So we had those kind of discussions from a basketball standpoint. And when the time came for me to go to Kentucky, I had a conversation with Calipari. It didn't go so well. Not that me and him had any problems. I didn't really like the scope, the microscope that was on Kentucky at the time, and what that meant for the players and how they lived day to day on the campus. So I decided to go to Iowa State, and that's where the magic began. Iowa State had been down for a while. They hadn't been having much success for about 7, 8 years. I had to go there. I had to sit a year. We filed a waiver for me to be able to play right away, which now in this day and age you can transfer without penalty. That wasn't the case then, so I had to sit a year. And Fred and those guys did well his first year. And then the second year when I was able to play, we got picked to finish in the last three or the bottom three of the Big 12. We ended up finishing third overall and making our first NCAA tournament appearance for Iowa State in the previous 10 years. So it was a big turnaround for Iowa State as a program at the time.
So, well, let me just mention a few of your basketball accomplishments here, and we're going to get into some of the issue with the NBA, and you're getting drafted in the first round there. We mentioned that you was Minnesota Mr. Basketball in 2009. You was a Jordan Brand All-American. We talked about your time at Iowa State, where you was the first team All Big 12. And then you did play in the Canadian National Basketball League, where you won a couple of championships. I think you were MVP championship twice, 2017 and 2018. You was MVP of the league in 2017. I found this interesting. You're a scoring champion. I never thought of you as a scorer, and we have to talk about that a little bit. You're a scoring champion in 2018. You was all NBL in Canada, first team 2017 and 2018. But first of all, before we start off with your first being a first round draft choice of the Houston Rockets, I just want to delve a little 1 second into the scoring champion thing. I never thought of you as a scoring champion, but you had it in you, huh, Royce? Explain that that experience being a scoring champion up in the Canada, just being that championship type of ball up
Well, you
there.
got to know that you have to know my history at LaSalle. When I played at LaSalle, I averaged probably 22, 23 points a game, and that's a lot even for a star player at LaSalle because Dave Thorson, back then ran an offense that was very conservative
Right.
offense. He emphasized getting the ball swung, ball reversals, and he really only wanted his best player taking shots. He was very big on shot selection. So even as the best player on the team at the time, I was very conscious of the shots that I took, even though I had the conceptual green light. So I was a scorer, in my early years in high school. And then when I got to Hopkins, I was playing with 8 other D1 players.
Right.
Some of them would be D1 later on when they graduated, who were younger than us. But I always tell people to understand how good our '09 Hopkins basketball team is. You have to realize that we had 2 people become Mr. Basketball that sat the bench when we played.
Right.
And that's because we had 5 seniors that all went on to play professional basketball and went to great D1 programs. And because of that, we blew a lot of teams out my senior year. So, we would be up 20-30 in the first 10 minutes of the game, and I'd sit the whole second half.
Right.
And so I only averaged about 14 points then. And also, I played with some other really good players, so I really liked and enjoyed distributing the ball at that juncture. And so on the circuit, I was always a scorer, right? I always was a guy who could put the ball in the basket on the circuit. And I guess when I got to Iowa State, we had a unique situation, right? I had to play point guard, and I knew that I had to sacrifice my scoring ambitions or my desire to score in order for the team to be as good as we possibly could, because we had a lot of shooters. We had a lot of guys who had transferred, who had some, you could say trouble at their previous schools, and just were looking for a new situation. So when you have that type of dynamic, you have to understand as the leader of the team or the best player on the team, how can I get the most out of the guys around me, right? And in order to do that, I had to be less concerned with scoring and more concerned with team morale. Okay.
Right.
When I got to Canada, all that was out the window, because by the time I had got to Canada, I had been blackballed from the NBA for four years, and so I had a chip on my shoulder. And it's not to say that I wasn't still passing the ball in Canada, because led the team in assists as well. But I was more focused, especially in a professional 4-quarter game. I was more conscious of my ability to be able to score 25, 26, 27 points over the course of 4 quarters.
So you mentioned being blackballed in the
Mhm.
NBA, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But first, you were first round draft choice. I think you were drafted number 16th in the first round by the Houston Rockets. Now, by that time, according to my understanding, they were aware of your, I think they call it generalized anxiety disorder.
Yes.
They were aware of that when they drafted you.
Yeah.
But somehow during that first year, seems like there was some miscommunication and misunderstanding there. And I'm not.
Now,
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Why don't you give me your side?
no,
I,
no.
okay, straighten us out here. I just know that you were in
Lacey,
the. It was in
hey,
the news, and
your
sometimes.
audience, your audience. I got to tell your audience,
Okay,
I
yeah,
love you. So
straighten
that's
it out.
first and
Come on for
foremost.
us. Okay.
But no, so I've been able to, you know, condense my initial conflict with the NBA down. So I'll take a few minutes just to kind
Right. Okay.
of unravel that, because the media industrial complex that we are fighting today was already at work back then when it comes to important social topics like mental health. But one of the subliminal issues in that was predatory psychological manipulation, and we'll talk about that shortly.
Okay.
We'll talk about that shortly. But when I left Iowa State, I had been really open, or during my final months at Iowa State, I had been open about my struggles with anxiety disorder, or my,
Hmm.
not even my struggles, let's just say my diagnosis with
Right.
anxiety disorder.
Uh-huh.
And so it became a big story. And the reason why it became a big story was because I was so open and talking about it with the media. Because at the time, I didn't really see any reason to try and hide it. I mean, it was something I dealt with, and I was like, hey, it actually came up spontaneously in an interview. Somebody asked me a question about, what my pregame ritual was, and I told them that I didn't eat before the games because of my anxiety, and my stomach got nervous on the morning of games, and he was like, wait, circle back? You can't just skip over that anxiety piece. What are you talking about? And I was like, yeah, I have generalized anxiety. I've been diagnosed since I was 16. So that was actually the start of it. Then the stories became about, me being a little bit nervous with flying and things like that. So by the time I had finished the season and we were in the NCAA tournament and we played UConn and Kentucky, which both had top 10 lottery draft picks on the team,
Hmm.
it became an even bigger story because I performed very well against those guys.
Hmm.
And the narrative was now, okay, not only is Royce's stock on the rise for the NBA draft, but it looks like he's a NBA ready guy right now. Like the way he's making these guys look tells us that he can step in and play for a team right now.
Hmm.
From a skill standpoint, footwork, just passion for the game, could do multiple things. I was the only player in the country to lead my team in all 5 major stats,
Yeah, I
which
read that.
is
Uh-huh.
rarefied air by any basketball standard. And the draft boards began to ask the question, okay, well, how is the NBA going to take this whole anxiety piece? And so that's when I started to hear it, because I got an agent, I declared for the draft, and then the conversations we had was, how are the NBA teams taking the anxiety piece? And it was in those conversations that we realized that the mental health topic was kind of uncharted territory for the NBA as an institution, at
Hmm.
least in the public sense, at least in having a public stance on mental health. So when the media came to me to ask me about it, it was almost as if the entire sports industry was quizzing me, or kind of giving me you know a pop quiz about mental health. And all I could take was a little bit of knowledge that I had acquired in a short time from being 16 with my doctors and my team trainers that had worked with me to help manage my anxiety. And so I was very raw and authentic in my answers.
Hmm.
Come up to the draft, and I get drafted 16th, but the consensus was that I was a top 5 talent, no doubt. And
Hmm.
in reality, I was so NBA ready that most people thought if Anthony Davis was one, then I was probably two or three.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had outplayed Anthony Davis so clearly in our game against each other when Iowa State played Kentucky in the tournament. So I dropped to 16. And then, when I got with Houston and I got to the team and we sort of went through the summer process of summer league, and then they have what's called a rookie transition program. I started to be very skeptical of how the establishment really viewed mental health as an issue. And I started to ask questions. And eventually, after our rookie transition program, which is the seminar that helps rookies transition into the league and avoid all of the landmines, right? The people who want to steal your money, the girl who's going to lie on you and say that you raped her, or your family member who's going to try and con you out. All of those four warnings from ex-players and attorneys and people from the league. That was kind of what the rookie transition program seminar is about, which they still have to this day. But during that seminar, I heard Chris Herron speak, who used to go to, who's from Boston. And he was the player who was famously had the very severe heroin addiction.
I remember.
Okay? He had one of the most powerful presentations I've ever heard in my entire life at that program. And he was very raw and authentic and honest about his experience being addicted to heroin. And I remember sitting there listening to it and understanding that some of the things I had felt internally with anxiety was what he was expressing in being addicted to heroin, even though my anxiety or my feelings weren't drug induced.
Right.
They were still similar. And what that triggered me to do was go back and read my collective bargaining agreement and check and see what the real policies were about mental health. And when I discovered there was not a single mention of mental health in our collective bargaining agreement, I asked the NBA to create a policy. And that's where the real friction started.
So on the surface, just asking the NBA to create a mental health policy, we don't see, at least I don't see why that should cause friction.
Well, here's the reason,
help explain
and I
that
didn't
for
know
us.
this then, but the reason why it caused friction was, number one, I was a young black male athlete who had the audacity to read my contract. Okay,
Gotcha.
Most of the, let's just be honest, most of the young black males who get drafted into the NBA have all of their agents look over all of their paperwork, and that's what the middlemen are there to do for young black athletes, because a lot of them come out of school early. And their education is shaky. There's nothing wrong with saying that. Any athlete who tells you otherwise is lying to you.
Okay.
So I was one of the very few athletes that had the inclination to really read my collective bargaining agreement line for line. And then when I challenged it, it was a total different level of audacity. It was, you're 21 years old, you've never scored a point in this league. How dare you question us about policy? And so those were all of the surface arguments. But what I realized later on was that the NBA is a representative of a global corporate community, okay? And the global corporate community's number one goal is to preserve the status quo at all costs, okay? And I was a disruptor. And not only was I a disruptor, I threatened to have other players disrupt as well. And ultimately, the question I was asking about mental health and what I was saying at the time about mental health wasn't really about anxiety or depression or OCD or even addiction. I was really saying that this meant the scope of mental health that you all have is actually off in its premise. You guys think of mental health as these anomalies, these players who are anomalies who usually get in trouble for some type of issue that they haven't dealt with. Which is a real thing. There are a lot of players who have mental health issues at the root of some of their troubles.
Right.
But I was trying to say and convey what the medical community had already agreed on, that mental health was really a spectrum for everybody, that everyone had mental health. And that actually more people who weren't diagnosed, there are more people with severe mental health issues that aren't diagnosed than there are people who are diagnosed, right?
Right.
2/3 of the people who have mental health who are mentally ill, let's say, never get diagnosed. 66% of the people with mental health issues never get diagnosed, and I actually think that that number is really conservative.
Right.
So what I was trying to convey is mental health is a better way to say the human condition, where mind, body, and spirit converge into our perceivable existence. If they were going to acknowledge that, they would have to divorce themselves from the ethos of the entire corporatocracy around them. And
Mhm.
one of the main one of the main ideas, or one of the main intentions of the corporatocracy in the years to come, was to ride the wave of big tech and a social media industry that had explicit plans to be predatory around human psychological vulnerability, right?
Mhm.
And see, I didn't know that at the time, but the corporatocracy knew. The NBA and their Wall Street friends, the bankers and the lawyers and the investment managers and the social media oligarchs, they all knew what the growth model was coming out of Silicon Valley. They
Mhm.
knew about the internet bubble, and they knew what they planned on doing with social media. And it was all predicated around dopamine. Okay. And
Mhm. Mhm.
dopamine is the drug that the social media oligarchs have now come out and said and admitted, we built our growth model on giving you a dopamine hit
Yep.
as fast as we possibly can in your
Yep.
user experience.
Yep. You know
Okay,
you're
so
getting
David
it.
Stern and those guys knew that. I had no clue. So I'm sitting here going, why don't you guys want a mental health policy? I had no clue that there was a $1 trillion power grab that was coming 4 years ahead of me.
Yeah, you're getting advanced here. Talking about the dopamine and the social media, and you're exactly right. So here's the thing: you talked about the collective bargaining agreement,
Mhm.
not addressing some of the mental health issues. Is there one thing that, a few things that you would have uh, instilled in the collective bargaining agreement? Give us a couple of things that you would have instilled in the collective bargaining agreement to address the mental health issue in a better way than they were currently addressing it.
Yeah, well, the first thing I would have done was just acknowledge that health for people in general, but especially players, but any employees, coaches, referees, the list goes on, need to be a comprehensive health model. Okay.
Right.
They wanted to separate physical and mental health.
I got you.
And then in the
Uh-huh.
separation of physical and mental health, they wanted to actually pretend that mental health didn't exist by not putting it on paper because they didn't want
Right.
to be responsible for it. So the first thing I would have did was said, hey, we're going to switch this health language that already exists in our collective bargaining agreement, and we're going to bring in mental health and create an addendum that acknowledges we need a comprehensive health model, that mental health and physical health are integrative. And I would have started there, and I would have definitely asked a huge question about the alcohol culture in pro sports. Those were all things that weren't even that they were just non-starters for those discussions. And I had those discussions with David Stern and the Houston Rockets and their attorneys and all of the people, all of the power players.
Right.
And behind closed doors, they all agreed. They just said, yeah, I mean, you're right. They couldn't really disagree because the doctors around the situation, even on the league side, were like, yeah, I mean, he's just right. And they didn't like that. So, all of it was a non-starter, no matter what I had suggested, really. But yeah, I would have started by just acknowledging mental health as an important key component of comprehensive health, and then I would have addressed the alcohol culture.
So, from a practical standpoint, here you are, one of the better players uh, in that rookie class.
Hmm.
You are drafted by the Rockets. Uh, Everything points towards you having a great NBA career,
Hmm.
and somewhere along the line there was a divergence, I guess, between your talents and your goals and
Hmm.
what the NBA and the Rockets were doing. Help our audience understand on a detailed kind of day to day basis what type of issues were you confronting that eventually led to that total divergence?
Well, I just asked the question, from the outset. I said, hey, where you guys stand on this mental health issue? And okay, is there a policy? Are you willing to make an addendum? If you're not, then we need to make a new policy, because one thing I'm not going to do is allow this mental health thing to hang out there just be this sort of cliffhanger that you guys then turn around and use on me when it becomes convenient for you,
Oh,
whether that be in a narrative way or an economic way, come
right.
contract time or whatever the case may be. And again, that was just a non-starter. They said, "Well, we'll deal in good faith." And any any knowledgeable American should know that you can never deal with the corporatocracy in good faith. Most things, if not all things, need to be in writing,
Hmm.
and they certainly feel that way. That's why they do business the way they do, where most things, if not all things, are in writing, except this mental health topic for some reason,
Right,
right?
right, right.
So once I asked the question, the fight was first with my team, then it was the league. The league tried to say, for example, one of my doctors recommended, hey, if you guys are in Chicago and you play in Milwaukee the next night, let them drive, right? That'll
Oh
take
yeah,
away
okay.
some of
Right.
the anxiety that he has with flying. Is that something we can work out? First, we had the team management say, yes, you can do that. That'd be great. We'll pay for the bus. That's no problem. Then the league came in over top of them and said, if you pay for ground transportation for Royce, we'll consider that salary cap infringement, and you guys could be fined in the millions of dollars and potentially lose draft
Ah,
picks.
okay, okay.
Yeah, and so right away I said, nah, that's it. We're going full stop. Either we're going to put a mental health policy in place, or I'm not playing.
Right,
Period.
right.
And we had to have that out, right? And eventually, what they did to get me to play or to report to the D League, because now since I've made this whole stink about this issue, now the punishment is you're going to the D
Right,
League.
right,
Right. When I was touted as the most NBA ready player at the
right,
time. So now they're punishing me by sending me to where? The Rio Grande Valley, where the DEA agent comes up to me at breakfast and tells me about the drug cartel problem there at the border
right,
over
right.
breakfast. That's where they have a D League team, because these people have no concept of responsibility, and they're radically negligent. But so I report to the D League on the basis that they promised to help put a mental health policy in place when the off season came. And when the offseason came, the Houston Rockets just traded me, and I never heard anything else about a mental health policy until 5, 6 years later, when Kevin Love spoke about having anxiety issues, and then the entire culture, be it
Okay.
the NBA and mainstream media as a whole, jumped on the mental health bandwagon. And here we are today. The same policies that I wrote out for the league, they
They
now have
implement.
in place, and I'm left not even being able to attend training camp. So that's what I mean by blackball.
Right, right. So now, when you were in Chicago and you could have taken ground transportation to Milwaukee, but the league had policies against that. By that time, you were already on contract, right? You had signed your rookie contract and
Yep.
and things like that. Uh, did they? Were you able to fulfill the whole first contract that you signed and fulfill those obligations? The league fulfill their obligations for paying you for what you were doing. Did that first contract get fully executed? Were there a time when you
No,
had
my
to just
first contract had a huge, uh, you know, dispute. Let's say
hmm
what the team resorted to when I say I wouldn't play if they didn't have a mental health policy was just to fine me,
okay, gotcha.
and they were fining me a bunch of money, basically until I would play. And then when their team doctors came in and said, no, he's actually right. You guys do need a mental health policy, because these general managers that went to
Right,
school for business management have no business with managerial autonomy over medical issues,
right,
uh,
right.
because they're just not competent in that field. Uh, so when that happened, then the tactic became, okay, well, we're going to send you to the psychiatrist every day forcibly. And if you don't go to psychiatrist, then we're going to fine you. And the psychiatrist, I go to the psychiatrist that they assign me to. We talk about the issue. I tell him I gripe with the lack of policy. He agrees with it. He offers to help bridge the gap and create the policy if that's something the team and league would be willing to do. And they weren't willing to work with him either. And so, he became the psychiatrist piece became weaponized against me in this sort of coercion to fall in line with the establishment.
So, what was the last year that you played in the NBA? And part B of that question is, are you ready, willing, and able to play in the NBA even today?
Oh yeah, I mean I'm ready physically and skill wise for sure. We have huge. I think I think the last year I played was that year. I didn't play again
Mhm.
after that.
Right, right, okay,
I was traded to the Philadelphia 76ers, and they cut me before the season started. And actually, Sam Hinkie, who was the GM in Philadelphia at that time, had come from Houston.
right, right,
So really, what Daryl Morey had done was trade and dump. It's called a trade and dump,
right.
where you basically send a player to somebody who you already know is
Still
going to
gonna
get rid
dump
of
them.
them because
Right.
you're trying to clear cap space. That's a game that's played that the fans don't know about behind the scenes in front office circles. But yeah, I mean, I guess me and the league still have a fundamental issue on multiple issues now, right? It started around mental health, and they tried to play fast and loose with the truth and do what the corporatocracy has tried to do to the working man, you could say, around the world. But later on, the issues would be, the Uyghurs, for example, or the vaccine mandates. So,
Right.
in theory, I've probably been blackballed now 3 or 4 different times on 4 different issues.
Now, so is there any chance that you will ever, now that we have more wisdom about mental health issues and other things, but the NBA still got its rules in there that you got to
Yeah,
follow, I
but
guess.
it was
Yeah.
just never about
Yeah.
mental health. It was never
Right.
about their rules.
Right. Right. I got you. I got
They are an institution that plays chameleonic politics, and they want to preserve the status quo. They're centrists.
you. Right.
Okay, they are part of a liberal machine, a liberal globalist machine that has hijacked the status quo. Okay, and now the way to hold the status quo is to create an ever expanding middle. Okay, and part of the ever expanding middle obviously is the race card, which they really don't believe in, really deep down, but it's just the default oppression claim to be made around most issues. But the real twin turbo engine, I say, is the ever expanding definition of gender and the ever expanding definition of sexual misconduct. And those are the two topics that they're going to make culturally uncivilized to disagree with. So they're going to try and force people to bend the knee to
Right.
their ideology. And so it was never about mental health, because any
Right.
sane person would agree that mental health is an important part of overall health. And when you look at it back in retrospect now, the fact that they actually now agreed with the mental health piece of it and have actually implemented the policies that I wrote out myself, it's clear that it was never about mental health. They're trying to preserve the status quo, and part of that status quo is that the power dynamic, especially operationally or policy wise, is keeps they keep far away from the athletes.
So you mentioned earlier about the orientation they give young players, rookies in the NBA, as far as the drugs and managing your money and the women and the social life.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find any of those things challenging for you personally? That looking back on it, you had some things in that area that you would have done differently? Did you run into any? I mean, you're young. Well, let me come at it this way: you're young, you're quote unquote spoiled and popular, and they give you money. How do you avoid some of those
Yeah,
pitfalls?
well, I don't agree that these young athletes are spoiled. I mean, we got to
Okay. Well,
remember.
yeah, that's a good point. We'll come back to that one. That's a good point.
I mean, I
Uh-huh.
just, but I understand that. See, the great American trick that's been played on the fans of sports
Mhm.
is that the athletes are prima donnas, divas, spoiled,
Yeah.
entitled, kind of lazy and irresponsible. But the reality is, there's kind of this. You could call it this. What would be the equivalent to an Overton window with corporations,
Right.
where they make it seem like the athletes aren't the common folk. But really, most of the athletes come from blue collar working families.
Right.
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 And so, it's like they're not really spoiled. I mean, the
Yeah.
dynamic between the team and the athlete, the organization and the athlete, is always one of who can get over on the other. And I think the team and the sports culture paint the picture that this is family fun. It's about teamwork and loyalty and camaraderie and self sacrifice. But they're all atheists. They don't believe in self sacrifice.
Right. Right.
They don't believe in Jesus. Let's just throw
Right.
it on out there. And even
Right.
furthermore, the bigger point is that, for example, it's not family fun. Okay? They use tax dollars to build parking structures next to arenas that were paid with tax dollars, and they sell alcohol until the fourth quarter, and they basically encourage people to drink and then get in their car and drive home with their kid. Let's be honest about what's
Right.
going on. So I reject the whole notion that these young athletes are, getting money and they're spoiled. Okay, yeah, 21-year-olds are going to make mistakes.
Right.
18-year-olds are going to make mistakes. We know that. But part of the whole culture too is that people are just kind of in this spirit of disavowing being a young man and what that means. Young men are supposed to make mistakes, not to excuse those mistakes. They should pay for their mistakes, and they should atone for their mistakes. But I just don't see, like, some of these things that they make a big deal out of with these athletes as being really that big of a deal
Yeah.
comparatively to what the establishment does. So
Right. Right. So, and that's a good point. You check me on the spoil because I've been around, especially college athletes,
yeah,
and I just know how hard it was for me to keep up without having to go on road trips and play in tournaments, finals week, and things like that. And my son happened to live in the dorm with some University of Minnesota basketball players, and just to see them walking around with little money, little time when you get through with the training and the practice and the studying and the trips and things like that. In fact, uh, their college life for them was probably twice as tough as it was for the average student. And so,
Lacy,
yeah,
we
yeah,
we used to get up. Look, imagine getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and going and running the mile. Okay, going to weight training, and then you got a 9 a.m. class,
right.
and it would and this is just to show you, try and connect the dots from the top down on how corporatocracy and establishment tyranny has festered in the shadows of the American people. Okay, they're now starting to pay players for their likeness, right? That's a recent development,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which I agree with. If you do the
Mm-hmm.
work and you're in a market and you bring in a certain amount of revenue, you're entitled to that money. This is the idea that you wouldn't be is kind of communist just in practice, right? It's like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you guys make all the money and you just decide what it is we need. It's like, no, that's not American. But just to go back to when I was in college, we had players who were getting NCAA violations and being suspended from teams for getting a ride to class
I
from
know.
team managers.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't even get me started on the NCAA.
Going to
Yeah,
going to class, you were actually getting penalized for getting a ride to go to school,
yeah, yeah.
because they said that was an extra privilege. So again, that was one of those situations where they spin the narrative like, well, all the other kids have to make their way to school, to class on their own. Yeah, and some of them are working and they have to balance their schedule. But the NCAA athletes have to maintain a certain level of credits in order to stay
Mm-hmm.
eligible by an arbitrary NCAA guideline. in order to graduate on time. When you're a regular student, you can graduate on your own at your own pace.
Right,
We know
right, right,
college students been
right,
in
right.
college for 10 years. But in order to be an NCAA athlete and be eligible, you have to be on par to on course to graduate in the 4 years you're scholarship, which makes sense.
Right,
But
right.
that means that the schedules are going to be on a very constrained basis, and the basketball schedule for your team may conflict with that. So if I'm
Yep.
rolling out of weights at 8:45, that means my team manager may have to get me across campus and drive me there, and I can't be penalized for that by the NCAA. That's just a racket,
Right, right, right,
right? And
right.
so, and that's where those things I think people have missed, and I just know about those things from actually having lived it.
So let's talk a little bit about your NBA experience and share a few things. I'm just curious about them personally.
Yeah,
Of all the players you played against, who were you most impressed by from a skill level? Where you say this is probably the best player I ever been on the court with.
that's tough, man. I mean,
Give me
this is
two or
a
three of them. Then give me a list. Pick out a few.
I mean, LeBron James is a freak. I didn't play against him in the NBA. I was one of the players when the Nike All American camps changed into the LeBron James Skills Academy. I was at the first annual and second annual LeBron James Skills Academy, which was the new Nike All American camp, top 100 camp. And LeBron James played with us during that time, and you know maybe it was just my 16-year-old eyes, but he was a freak.
Right,
Let's just
right,
put it
right,
like
right,
that.
right.
Right? He was incredible as an athlete, and you know I played with James Harden, so he's an
Nice.
incredible basketball player, a very skilled, very knowledgeable, crafty, talented, creative basketball player. Um, and yeah, I mean, I used to play at the gym with KG, and KG was an incredible player as well. So yeah, I mean, those would
Yeah.
be three that I would throw out there. You know, just off the top of my head.
Yeah. So, and as long as we're talking a little bit about the mental aspect of the game, as you move like from one level to the next, there's a mental adjustment. Like when you move from high school to college,
Hmm.
you got everybody who was Mr. Basketball now on your team, and
Yeah,
and you aren't the top dog number necessarily. You have to earn their pecking order. And when you're in high school and you're the star player, you can miss the first 3 or 4 or 5 shots, and you know your teammates still got confidence in you. But now you're thrown into this group of strangers. You have to prove yourself all over again, and then same thing going from college to the NBA. How did you handle the mental aspect of going from one level of competition to the next? And what made you not lose your confidence?
I mean, for somebody who lived with anxiety disorder, I think I proved that anxiety is not what people think it would be. That there
Right,
are plenty of people that not only function well with anxiety but are high functioning. I mean, I was living and playing with anxiety disorder, and I was All American D1 athlete in a Power Six conference in the Big 12. Um, and you know, from a mentality standpoint, I always came with a chip on my shoulder because Minnesota never got any respect.
right, right,
So every time I was in a new environment or a new setting where there were players that weren't from Minnesota, I always
right.
played with a chip because I had something to prove, and I didn't really, you know, I was a scrappy player. You know, I get in your face. I trash talk you. I just won the Trash Talk of the Year award in the Big Three this past season.
Oh yeah, we're gonna talk about that a little
The
bit.
previous winners were Steven Jackson and Gary Payton. So you know
Oh
I'm in
yeah,
good company
oh
with those
yeah,
two. They're
oh
bona
yeah.
fide trash talkers. So you know I was a trash talker and I was gritty and I just played hard. You know I took it very serious. And when I wasn't on the court, I spent time watching film. I spent time in the weight room. I was a fanatic about doing push-ups and just strengthening my body when I was at home in my downtime. And you know, so by the time I got on the court, I was confident in my ability to be able to play with anyone, really.
Wow. So you mentioned your 3-on-3. We had talked about your college, high school, college, NBA career, Canadian professional career, but you're also involved right now on the, I think it's called Big Three, 3-on-3. Tell us a little bit about that league and what's going on there. And I think you really had recently had a tournament. I think you did in California, something in California. Tell us about the 3-on-3 league that
Yeah,
you
well,
professional league you're involved in.
the Big Three was a league that was started by Ice Cube, and the
Yep. Yep.
concept of it in its origins was that there were all these players who had retired from the NBA but still liked to play. Maybe they were a little old and their bodies couldn't necessarily do the things that they used to do, but they still wanted to play, and a lot of people still wanted to see them play, and still wanted to be able to, engage with them and watch them. And so I think that was the inception of the Big Three. And then I think that Ice Cube realized that, wait a second, there are players out there who aren't retired, who the establishment just missed, or in my case, blackballed. And so
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't involved in the Big Three until season 3, and they had lowered the age, the minimum age, down to 25 that year. And then COVID hit. So I played in that first season. That went well. We had a blast, and we were still traveling out on the road, city to city. Then the following season, I was going to play again, obviously, but COVID canceled our season. That was 2020. And this past season was the first year that we were back playing, and we were mainly based in Las Vegas. And we had 1 week where we traveled to Dallas. We were supposed to do Dallas, New Orleans, but New Orleans had a COVID spike, and so we ended up shifting gears and going to Milwaukee, Chicago, because they have a big following, or a big market for the Big Three in the summers.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I got COVID that week, so I ended up missing 3 games in 10 days because we had 2 Thursday, Saturday, and then the following Saturday, and I was on a 14-day quarantine at the time. But the season went well overall. It was fun. I had a lot of moments. I made a lot of statements, a lot of political statements. They let me say what I want to say, and just the entire Big Three staff, the ownership, the board, all of those people are very supportive of who I am personally, and I respect Ice Cube a lot for doing that. It comes at a great cost to him personally, I know, and the Big Three as a league, to be able to stand in the fire and take the heat for some of the stuff that a player like me says, or some of the other guys as well. But we're starting to get younger now in the Big Three, and the teams are getting good, and it's very competitive because we're getting much younger now.
I have a lot of respect for Ice Cube. I've heard him talk on quite a few things, economic development and just societal type things. So I have a lot of respect for him. If the our audience want to follow you on the 3-on-3 circuit, what's the name of your team that you're on?
I play for the Power, but when the Big Three plays,
Hmm.
all the teams play on the same day. So if
Right.
when the Big Three season
I
starts,
see. Yep. Yep. Yep.
we're usually on CBS on Saturdays, and I believe we have an agreement still for this next coming season with CBS on Saturdays, and we also played with the Triller app, which is a new sports app. You've seen some of the latest boxing fights on that. The Jake Pauls and people like that are, the Triller's starting to get into sports a little bit. So we were on that app. But yeah, I mean, CBS, we're on CBS on Saturdays. So, we all play on the same day.
Yeah, and I've seen that. I'll watch for you there. And then, by the way, I'm going to go back and watch your Kentucky Iowa State game and against Anthony Davis. And yeah, I remember seeing you in some of those tournaments. A couple of things. We got to wrap it up here. I'm going to have you back because I don't pace things enough well here. You did also have some experience in MMA, mixed martial arts. Am I correct there? Have you made your professional debut? Or are you still at the amateur level? What's your
Yeah.
plans in that particular profession?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been training. I decided to start training mixed martial arts back in 2019, middle 2019, and yeah, I just made my professional debut here in December, this past December 10th, so about a month ago. and I lost in a decision. But I felt really comfortable in there. I did some things now looking back that a lot of people run into trouble with just from having their first fight. And my first fight was professional. I didn't have any amateur fights, which most
Right.
guys take some amateur fights first. But just being who I am, I wanted to jump right in the fire. And I performed well, given that. I probably should have won the fight. Just a couple of things that I needed to adjust, and I would have won the fight pretty easily. I was never hurt in the fight. I never felt like I was in danger in the fight. I spent 3 5 minute rounds in the cage, and I still look this beautiful. So
I love
I'm confident about going forward with MMA, and I'm scheduled to fight again April 15th back out at Mystic Lake Casino, and I'm excited. I love MMA. I love training. Martial arts has been a godsend to me in terms of to find an arena to compete again, but also understanding the long term benefits of discipline. And martial arts brings a different level of discipline and commitment than I think people really understand and realize. And it's been a godsend for me, no doubt.
Okay. So, Royce, we really appreciate you being here and sharing your experiences with us. A couple of quick things before we go, because I'm running a little late. But I
Yeah.
do know that you do have, as you indicated, the audience probably have concluded already that you have a social conscience and that you were involved in some of the activities around the George Floyd killings. I know,
Mhm.
as you indicated earlier, you seem like you're more conservative than a liberal. So tell us about your activities in the social arena and how your political conservatism impact what you do in that area.
Well, I think it, it, I, I'm not so sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, good.
Feel free to correct me, by the way.
It's not to correct you. I would just say that the political spectrum has been, upside down, spun in a circle over the last 30 to 40 years. And really, it even goes back to post World War II. But that conversation is for another time. I would say this: my political affiliation is to the people, okay, the free people of America and the free people of the world, the working class, the common folk. And I never really much affiliated with a political party. I grew up in the Rondo community, which is, I think, by standards, of, historically a liberal community. Although, black men, there is a small subset of black men that have traditionally voted Republican. I just feel that when I decided to step into the public arena at 21 years old and talk about an issue that was supposed to be bipartisan, and I saw a liberal establishment that had promoted themselves as being human rights oriented or human welfare oriented, try to subvert me, try to undermine me, and also and ultimately try to defame and mischaracterize me, I understood that the political game was being played in a very dirty way. Okay,
Mhm.
and that would come to fruition. My skepticism about that would be found warranted in the years that have followed. Over the, this 2013 is what, 8 years ago, right? That's how much our political landscape has changed over the last 8 years. And I guess I was raised Catholic. Okay, so I'm a Catholic on multiple sides of my family. My Mexican family's Catholic. My black family was Catholic. I was baptized in St. Peter Claver under Father Kevin McDonough there in St. Paul, who is um, a very loved person in our community. So I have those values. I believe in Jesus Christ. So I guess by our political standards now, that automatically makes you a conservative.
Yeah, I guess that is.
And I think where the political arena has come now, I certainly am a conservative, and proudly so. I believe that men are men and women are women, and yeah, I don't think adults should be able to have conversations with my children about their genitals or their sexual orientation without my consent at the public schools we pay tax dollars for. I think the Church of LGBTQ is being merged with the state instead of being kept separate, which is unconstitutional, and in my opinion. And the same thing for the scientism that's making its way into our lives every day. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, just from a political worldview standpoint. But I think a lot of people had misconceptions about who I am, because after George Floyd was murdered, and I do believe he was murdered, the court did the court findings, or the verdict says
Mm-hmm.
that he was murdered. But I felt the need to go out into the community at that time and lead. And I wasn't exactly sure what that meant. I knew what I had experienced with the NBA, with the corporatocracy, with this negligent, arrogant move towards globalism, and ultimately tyranny and establishment status quo. And I felt like the George Floyd situation was going to be a time where people came together in the community and exchanged ideas.
Right.
And I had a feeling that people were going to be misled during that time.
Right.
So I stepped up. And by default, because the majority of the people who participated in protests post George Floyd were at least loosely associated with Black Lives Matter, the organization, many people just assumed that I was Black Lives Matter, but I've never been involved with that organization. I'm not involved with that organization. And in fact, I couldn't disagree with the ethos of that organization more on a fundamental level.
Right.
Obviously, I have already expressed plenty of ideas that suggest that I'm very anti neoliberal wokeism.
Right.
And I think there's a ton of double crosses, triple crosses, and outright lies that are taking place with that movement, at minimum. And there's worse stuff than that.
Right.
Worse stuff primarily being that they're radical atheists, and this entire neoliberal movement is really predicated around the proliferation of sin. But yeah, I think that
Right.
when it came to George Floyd, I didn't see his murder as the direct product of a racist cop.
Right.
Okay, it's
Right.
not for me to understand what was in Derek Chauvin's mind the day
Right.
that George Floyd died. Okay, and from being a mental health advocate, I know how complex the human psychology can be.
Right. Right. Uh-huh.
So to assess those kind of things on the spot in a situation like that is tough anyway. But guess
Mm-hmm.
what? I don't need to know those things in order to know that Derek Chauvin was guilty in
Right.
contributing to the death of George Floyd. And I also went out to tell people that the bigger question that must be asked is about the monopoly on violence that the state has, and what the implications are for our lives, irregardless of the cop civilian dynamic. And that the police departments were really pawns of a bigger corporatocracy, which is why we led our protests to the Federal Reserve and asked the question, where's the $30 trillion? Where did $30 trillion go that we've run up in national
That.
debt?
That. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I asked those questions, and ultimately I told the people when I went out to protest, listen, the state has a monopoly on violence, and it was George Floyd now, but it'll be you tomorrow. And a lot of people, even conservatives, would disagree with that. But I would caution them to look at the vaccine mandates and who will carry out those mandates. See, one of the huge conservative values that you and I understand is the rule of law,
Mm-hmm.
right? But my point was to the Black Lives Matter crowd, you could say, if that's what you want to call them. I know many people out there weren't Black Lives Matter too, but that was the general banner that was being flown. which we denounced. We tried to denounce that intentionally and said, no, we're the free people of America. This is our organization. You guys can walk with us because this is a free country. And if
Right.
MAGA people wanted to walk with us or anybody else, that would be their right. And we would invite that because ultimately we are fighting against an establishment tyranny. But my bigger point to them was, and my point to conservatives even now is, when the rule of law, when lawmakers are blatantly corrupt, are outright corrupt, then the people who enforce laws are also corrupt. And the rule of law is undermined. Okay, so it doesn't have to be about George Floyd. That mentality, that culture is going to come down to bear heavy on all of us, and it's happening right now with the vaccine mandates. Right. The police are going to be the one. The police are the ones that are arresting cerebral palsy, handicapped, middle-aged white women in New York City for eating in a restaurant without a vaccine card. So to me, she's George Floyd. She wasn't killed, fortunately, but there will come a day very soon if we don't change the trajectory of this thing where police are going to use all of their misplaced aggressions on the citizens. And ultimately, I told the Black Lives Matter crowds, listen, we have to have a full-throated conversation about citizenship. And what is the value of citizenship? What does it mean? What does sovereignty mean? And they looked at me like I had three eyes. They're like,
well, because they don't care
tyranny,
about
sovereignty, citizenship. What are you talking about? We're here to talk about intersectionality. And I was just like, all of you are corrupt. And they wanted me off the front line for that. But I just told them, hey, listen, I'm a black man. I don't have to go anywhere.
That's a good thing to end on. But here's the thing, and I've been waiting for this. We're going to end on a positive note to our young people. And we talked before, of course, we've talked before. And one of my pet peeves is you got these athletes making worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And when they talk to our youth, they're talking to them about how unfair life is and all the obstacles out there. They're not talking to them about setting goals, sacrifice, making good choices, working hard. I don't hardly hear any of that come out of any of our professional athletes when they're talking to our children. Our children already hear enough all day, every day, how unfair life is and how what happened 300 years ago you can't overcome and those type of things. I'm looking for one professional athlete to talk to our children about things like discipline and education and sacrifice, and not make it sound like they're a victim of anything. So leave us with a positive message for our young people, Royce.
Well, I think that the great thing about this country is that there are a lot of things in motion that are obstacles for a lot of people, primarily the working class, irregardless of race. But the way our country has been set up, you do have the opportunity to overcome those obstacles, depending upon how focused and determined and disciplined you are. At the same time, I don't lie to young people. I don't lie to my kids. I wouldn't lie to your kids. I wouldn't lie to anybody's kids. I think this radical paternalism that the establishment has engaged in is part of the reason we're in the crisis we're in. So I tell kids the truth. And the truth is that they have been lied to. And I'm not talking about black kids. I'm talking about kids in general. And they will continue to be lied to. And the great lie is that they live in a country where the value of freedom is first and foremost. And that's not true. It's not true. That's in danger. And it's going to be their generation that has to make a decision on whether this country moves closer to freedom or tyranny. And I would tell them that, or encourage them that, if you correct for the 3/5 of human in the Constitution, in the early, in the Constitution, that we have a good Constitution. We have a Constitution that's a great foundation for society, for a country, that America is a great country. It definitely has some huge problems. Most of them have to do with people trying to subvert the Constitution. And I'm not talking about the insurrectionists on January 6th. I'm talking about the intelligence community, for example, that conspired with the telephone companies to surveillance everyday Americans unconstitutionally. So they're going to be the ones that get to decide where this country is going, and freedom should be their choice. Freedom should be what they fight for, and that there's real glory in that, and that there's real reward with God in this life and the next through that. And yeah, that's what I would tell young people: fight for freedom, and seek first the kingdom of righteousness of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you.
Good thing to end on, except I got one last thing, and I can't let you go without. You got a T-shirt on there.
Yeah.
Tell us the story behind your T-shirt there.
I will. Yeah, quick 2-minute story. A little quick couple minutes. The Uyghurs, I think, is one of the defining issues of our time, if not the defining issue of our time. It is one of those issues that's a litmus test for ideas like justice and freedom. And we live in a society that is full of virtue signaling, full of phony humanitarians. And I think that their plight, what they're facing, this genocide that's being perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party there in East Turkestan, where they've put these ethnic minorities, these Turkic Muslims, these Chinese Muslims in concentration camps, is one of the most atrocious things to happen in our generation. And I see a bunch of people, Black people, by the way, Black elites, Black public figures who have platforms, look away from this issue as though the injustice being done to these 2 million Muslims is not a reflection of our own moral decadence, of our own capitulation and selling out. I wear the shirt because every time I get a chance, because I think the establishment has done a good job to downplay just how serious of an issue this is, and what the implications are for the world. And make no mistake about it, America is divided right now. And I'm not talking about Trump and Biden. I'm talking about people who believe in freedom, who believe in America, and people who believe that America is just going to be a part of this new global society where we're all global citizens. But really, it means you don't own anything and you're going to like it. Right? You don't own a single, and you don't have any real citizenship, because once the constraints are off and it's global, there's no value to where you belong to, your nation. And that's the fundamental mechanism of the nation state. So, just for example, the World Economic Forum, which is a global organization that brings together the world's leaders of industry and tech and thought leaders and authors and all of these different media and everybody else. The world's most influential people held their summit for the year, and they invited Xi Jinping, the president of China, to be the keynote speaker. And it's not by coincidence that the follow-up speaker was Dr. Fauci. Okay. There is a very strong contingent of people in America that is completely fine with China's rise to power, because they covet the authority of Xi Jinping. They are okay with authoritarianism, and it's the liberal establishment for sure. But there's also a bunch of neocons and rhinos in the Republican Party that have played their role in the rise of China as well. It's kind of this, let's fatten our pockets on the way down idea, right? And I don't know what these people think, to be honest, Lacy. I don't know if they think that when the stuff hits the fan the next time, all these people who are trying to save their shekels, there's bitcoins and cryptos and stocks and bonds and investments and real estate and all. It's not going to be there when the stuff hits the fan the next time. Okay, nobody's getting bailed out. And if you
Right.
do get bailed out this time, it's going to come with an explicit agreement that your morality and freedom are going along with the bailout. And there's going to be no place in the Chinese empire paradise for some of these sellouts like Nancy Pelosi and Biden and Mitchell McConnell and all of these other capitulators. So, yeah, the Uyghurs are an example of an oppression and a genocide against them, but they're a sign of the things to come.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot to talk about when we go out and grab a cup of coffee or whatever, a beer or lunch or whatever, about geopolitical and strategies and history. And I'm looking forward to that. Once again, very proud of you as Minnesota athletes who went on to bigger and better things. You haven't forgotten where you came from. You haven't forgotten your principles. You haven't forgotten your faith. And we just ask you to keep up the good work. And I like to personally thank you for being on the guest on our podcast. And so, looking forward to seeing you soon, and very proud of your accomplishment. Keep fighting for us out there.
Thank you, brother.
Okay.
Godspeed.
Yeah, same to you, Royce. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And for our audience, thank you for joining us. I hope you had a peek at the life of a professional ball player, someone who still remember where he come from, still connected to his community, still in personal principles. And let's go out and make this the best country we can make it, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good night from Lacy Johnson at Bright Lights. Thank you.